Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Talk to the man, Mr. President. This is what some are saying to Barack Obama as he and his Iranian counterpart addressed the United Nations. Well, hardliners in both countries, particularly the U.S., deride diplomacy and honest negotiations. There appears to be a genuine moment for engagement. Can the U.S. ever take yes for an answer? To CrossTalk Iran-U.S. relations, I'm joined by Geneive Abdo in Washington. She is a fellow at the Stimson Center at the Brookings Institution. We also have Tighe. He is the Washington, D.C. director of Code Pink. And in Irvine, we cross to Soraya Sepahpour-Ulrich. She is an independent researcher and writer. All right, CrossTalk rules in effect, folks. That means you can jump in anytime you want. Tighe, if I can go to you first in Washington. In politics and diplomacy, I've always been told never use the following 6 words. This time it will be different. This time, will it be any different between the two countries, the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran?
Well, we certainly hope so. We've seen that the United States has had sanctions on Iran since 1975. They've been boosting the rhetoric. It's time for the president to meet. I'm appalled at the language of will they meet in the halls and will they be able to shake hands. We saw that the president of Iran put out an op-ed asking for the United States to come to a meeting to talk as sovereign nations and to come to an agreement, as Barack Obama in 2008 in his election bid promised he would do. And that's what the majority of the American people want. They want the two presidents to come together, have a conversation that leads to an end to these horrible sanctions that are killing only the people of Iran and not the governments involved.
Geneive, can it be different this time around? And if it can be different this time around, why?
Well, there are a lot of reasons that it's different this time. And first of all, we have what appears to be a sort of different political culture now in Iran. A more moderate faction is now holds the presidency. Ayatollah Khamenei has endorsed President Rouhani's calls for some sort of progress on the nuclear issue. And this is very different from previous presidents, even the former president Mohammad Khatami, who was a reformer. So he was much more liberal than President Rouhani, but he did not have the backing of the supreme leader. So we've seen even the leader place his credibility on the line ahead of this meeting, and this is why it's so important, and this is why it's different. You also have Syria in the background. Iran sees an opportunity because it has so much power in Syria. It's arming the opposition. The Revolutionary Guards are fighting inside Syria. So I suspect that if the Iranians are smart, they will come to the negotiating table and say, okay, we're ready to move to some sort of transitional government without Assad, but this is what we want in return. We want, as you mentioned, some of the sanctions to be lifted. And so I suspect that that's going to be part of the conversations if indeed they go on.
Soraya and Irvine, so what, all the Iranians just have to be good now, okay, and they have to respond to what Washington wants. But what about their needs, okay? What does Washington have to do?
Peter, I'm not sure where the lady from Brookings gets her information from. As far as Syria is concerned, this is simply about Iran. And as you mentioned, there is really nothing much different. Iran had offered to engage previously. Iran did suspend its nuclear program in 2003 for 2 years as an act of good faith. So while one has a lot of hope on the current discussions, surrounding the current discussions, and to borrow from Martin Luther King, one would face finite disappointment, but one should never give up indefinite hope. I think there is hope there, but one has to understand that Washington needs to change. Washington, the nuclear program, the civilian nuclear program, is an excuse for Washington to impose these sanctions. It's not a reason. And so until they come to terms with the fact that Iran will never give up its rights.
Okay, Geneive, go ahead, jump in, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay, we actually have a fire alarm here, but I just want to jump in to say that this conversation is a little too slanted and biased. it's both sides that need to compromise. It's not just Washington. Iran has a whole history of deceiving the international community about its nuclear program. It's documented. It's on record. This isn't information that should be debated. But I've been told now I have to leave the building, so
Madam,
I will be back
now
at
you're
some
being
point.
biased, madam. I think you have inaccurate. I think you need to. For one thing, Brookings, one knows that it's actually a pro-Israel think tank that does spew out these reports and these inaccuracies. So I think that you need to come to terms with what is actually real and what is not. And there is absolutely not one iota of truth in what you just mentioned. Iran has always been transparent about its nuclear program. In fact, in 1982, Iran did say that it wants to start up its nuclear power plant again in 1983 using its own uranium in Isfahan. In 1983, the IAEA went to Iran with the aim of helping Iran do this, which is what the IAEA is supposed to do, as are all the P5, the nuclear power countries. But under pressure from the United States, the IAEA stopped helping Iran. They pulled back. And for years and years and years, Iran solicited help from different countries, and every time pressure from the United States, they stopped the development of the program. It's never been secret, and this is just inaccurate. It's always been out there.
All right, Tighe, if I go to you in Washington, let me go to Tighe here. I mean, it was something was mentioned here I think is very interesting. It has really nothing to do with Iran's nuclear ambitions. It's always been about regime change, okay? The Americans still have gotten over the hostage crisis. I remember it vividly. But it's still regime change. That's what they want. How can you have a dialogue if that's the end game for Washington?
Well, you absolutely can't. And I think the American public has gotten over the Iran revolution a long time ago. It's these hardliners in Congress. But they're being pressed by this foreign lobbying group that's allowed to walk around on Capitol Hill without registering as a foreign lobbying group. I'm referring to AIPAC, the American Israel Political Affairs Committee. But we saw the massive failure of AIPAC to try and get the United States to be involved in another military action in the Middle East in Syria. They even admitted their failure. We see, again, it's going to boil down to whether or not Iran can convince this administration to keep the hard line. And I just like to also put in the fact that for over the last 10 years, I've been told that Iran is 6 months away from having a nuclear weapon. Once again, Netanyahu has said they're 6 months away from having a nuclear weapon if the United States doesn't continue these sanctions, add more sanctions. And as we saw in Iraq, when Madeleine Albright, former ambassador for the United States, was asked a direct question, was the death of 500,000 Iraqi children worth it? She said yes. And this administration is carrying on in that tradition of they don't care how it affects the average Iranian person. They only care what political advantages they can get out of it in Washington.
Soraya, is this just inertia here?
No,
I mean, it's interesting because all my adult life, you know, and when I was living in the United States, is that Iran is simply the enemy. It's just, you know, mass media, the networks just assume that, okay, without knowing much about Iran. I mean, what can Iran do to get someone's attention beyond just capitulating, which it won't?
I really doubt there's anything much Iran can do. I mean, Mr. Rouhani is doing a fine job of presenting Iran's position. And even his charm offensive, as they call it, is offensive to the hardliners, to the neocons in Washington. They've put certain labels on him. They're calling him a wolf in sheep's clothing and what have you. So you cannot face the American population with charm and the policymakers, and you can't face them with rhetoric. No matter what you do, you're damned. So Iran has little choice here in this matter, unless, as I said, Washington is the one that needs to change its attitude. And it's very hard for Washington to do this because it's been controlled by outside powers, as your guest Tighe said. And it's very important to understand that none of this benefits Washington. There are only a certain Washington, a small elite in Washington do benefit, and the military-industrial complex, the media, and the lobby groups. But the American people are suffering as much as, perhaps not dying due to sanctions, but all the wealth that is being spent on wars and filling the pockets of the warmongers is being taken away from the American people. So American people here, somehow the Iranians, the people of Iran and the American people have to come together and understand that they're both being harmed, and this message has to be conveyed. And in this age of internet and communication, fortunately, it's not so easy for the Washington political elite to cover up their actions, to mislead the people. The word is getting out there, and it's just the Syria war was stopped, and I think temporarily, pretty much because the American public were not behind it. They've wisened up. And I hope, and it's my hope, and it's the only way
it's interesting that you say that about wising up. Let me go to Tighe here before we go to the break. You know, wising up, the same people that brought us to war in Iraq are the ones talking about Iran. I mean, it's remarkable. They're experts on both countries, aren't they?
This is a failure of the news media in Washington, D.C. I see the same experts. I don't see Medea Benjamin, co-founder of Code Pink, on CNN, on MSNBC, on Fox TV, continually over and over, talking about the failures of the Bush administration, the Obama administration in its wars on the Middle East, in the wars in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen. The United States is stretched out all over the globe, fighting wars with drones. We need to bring truth to power, and the fact of the matter is they got it wrong. The American public needs to understand there are even still people like John McCain, who the other day at Brookings said that it was a win in
All right,
Iraq.
on that very hilarious note here, we have to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Iran and the United States. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the relationship between Tehran and Washington. Okay, Soraya, I'd like to go back to you in Irvine because you got up so early for this program. You know, at the end of the first part of the program, Ty mentioned John McCain, and we all know that John McCain sent his op-ed to a publication, Pravda, that is hardly in existence. I've lived here for 15 years. I've never seen the newspaper, but he apparently thinks it's an important newspaper in Russia. So, Soraya, you know, the American people are told day in, day out for 15 years, 20, 30 years, Iran is the greatest threat to the United States. How is that possible?
Well, if Americans think that Iran is such a threat to them, then they're the ones who should be subjugating their rights to Iran. But that's not the case. I think America and Israel specifically, they need an enemy to divert the attention away from the people. Yes, Iran is a threat in that it claimed its independence. It was almost a colony of the Americans, and it claimed its independence, and it's something that America, which is an empire, a declining empire, cannot afford to have countries getting away from under its influence and becoming self-sufficient. So in that sense, America's weary of Iran. But as far as the threat goes, I mean, right now we're talking about Iran and Syria, whereas in Israel, they've just occupied homes that belong to Palestinians. 300 militants attacked and took over the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. So as long as there is a threat out there that the Israelis and the hardline Americans, neocons, I call them, point the finger to, we don't need to discuss the issues that are actually creating conflict, that are illegal, that are breaking every law of morality and international law. So that's why Iran is presented as a threat. And Peter, I think I would very much like for your audience to Google, if they can, in 1975, or prior to the Iranian Revolution, the Shah of Iran was a poster boy for nuclear power plants, for Edison Company. He had his uniform and his medals, and America bragged about how important it was to have nuclear energy. And now the Americans are saying that Iran cannot have its own nuclear civilian program. So if anybody in Iran is under the impression that it's the regime that must be eliminated, but how can you possibly blame them? I mean, they killed the scientists. They tried to stage a coup against Iran. They negotiated a coup
cyber attacks, very elaborate cyber attacks,
imposing sanctions on them. So, yes, and so Iran is the one that should be apprehensive about Washington. And very often it's being said that Iran is the one buying time because they want to develop a nuclear bomb. Well, this is false. I think that Washington, in fact, and Israel are buying time. For one thing, they want to make sure they have an alternate route to the Strait of Hormuz, which is very important to the world economy. They do not have that yet, so they cannot risk an attack on Iran per se at the moment. And it's important to understand that if Iran is reaching out the way it has with the full backing of the Iran Supreme Guide, Ayatollah Khamenei, then if these talks don't go anywhere, then we can actually look and see who the culprit is. And this is why it's important. This is why Mr. Rouhani's message is so important, and the very able Javad Zarif, the foreign minister.
It's very interesting. If I go to Tighe here,
and Washington doesn't want it.
Let's talk about Washington. It seems to me that Obama's hands are tied. I mean, he has a lot less wiggle room here because of the lobby that you were mentioning and the bad history that the countries have, which I would primarily put most of the blame on the United States. His hands are tied. He doesn't really have any opportunity. He can shake a hand, I guess, but what good will it do if the entire establishment that has input on the policy on Iran, they won't budge. They simply won't budge, because even if they get a good deal, they don't want a deal. They can't accept yes.
I'm just a little stunned, because isn't he supposed to be the most powerful man in the world? I don't know where they on one hand they want to say American exceptionalism and the most powerful person on the planet is the President of the United States, yet he can't even shake hands in the hallway with the President of Iran. I find it, I don't believe the president's hands are tied. The president came into office in 2008 saying he was going to bring peace with Iran. He was going to talk to them as two sovereign nations, and he's never done that. Read Trita Parsi's single roll of the dice. The United States never made an effort to work with Iran. And yes, he is influenced heavily by this. Technically, it's very illegal that Israel has a foreign lobbying group on Capitol Hill that's not registered with the Justice Department. Look that up as well. But they are powerful, AIPAC. But as we saw in the Syrian debacle, that they came up well short. They were. I was on Capitol Hill. I had a protest in front of the House office buildings, and you saw them in hordes, in the thousands. These AIPAC lobbyists coming there, and they got nowhere. Now, the other issue is that was brought up on, as far as this Syria war on Syria from the United States. It was discussed overwhelmingly in the halls that the reason that Assad would have these chemical weapons was a deterrent to Israel's over 200 atomic weapons. And these weapons are pointed at Syria. And if he does have, and apparently he does have these chemical weapons, it's because Israel is such a dominant power in the Middle East without stating the fact that they do have nuclear weapons. You go on any of these talk shows and no one will ask the direct question, what about Israel's nuclear power? And it's only right that Iran should have nuclear power so it can sell its oil overseas. Iran does not process, refine oil. If they were able to sell their oil and use nuclear power for their energy consumption at home, this would make Iran a very powerful, very wealthy nation.
And independent.
One last thing is,
independent
I'm from Los
nation.
Angeles.
Okay.
And independent.
Right.
And I'm from Los Angeles. And Los Angeles is home, what they call it Tarantulas. And Los Angelinos who are of Iran descent, Persians there in Los Angeles, are overwhelmingly say no attack on Iran. Let's sit down and talk. They want to go home. They want to have businesses in Iran. It's time to end this blockade, like the infamous blockade on Cuba.
Okay,
it's time.
Let me go to Soraya. Soraya, we have a lot of examples out there. We have North Korea that won't disarm. We had Iraq that did. Libya that did, and we know what happened to Iraq, and we know what happened to Libya. I mean, anyone in Tehran, you know, and rational thinker is going to say, why should we go down this path? I mean, they put out these overtures, and then they invade you.
Well, that's right, Peter. And also, Mr. Netanyahu has ordered that Iran should stop uranium enrichment altogether. I think what's being left out is why Iran needs to enrich uranium. It's not just for the nuclear power plants, but Iran had a huge share, and it still has a huge share, in Eurodef. The Shah of Iran invested in Eurodef, and they enrich uranium, and they refuse to supply Iran. So Iran cannot develop its oil fields. You know, there are sanctions in Iran, 1996 sanctions, that has nothing to do with the nuclear power plants. And it can't invest in its oil fields, it can't have any foreign investment, it can't have nuclear energy. So what are the Iranians supposed to do? You can't have 75 million people perish because Mr. Netanyahu or Israel needs to point a finger at somebody else. Plus the fact that Iran needs these medical isotopes, which it did put on the table, the 20% enriched isotopes, for medicinal purposes. Now, because of the sanctions, because there can be no banking going back and forth, there are children, women, and old people dying because America needs to impose its will. And it just shows you that America, United States, which calls itself defender of human rights, it actually kills women, children, and the helpless. That's not greatness, that's weakness.
That's right.
And I think that, you know, Iran and Russia, now that, they are working more and more together, and hopefully there will come a point where even if Iranians are sacrificed, I think that a lot of them would rather die standing up than to live on their knees. And they will not stop, although they would want to work with Washington.
You know, Tighe, it seems to me that in the last 10 years, particularly the last 10 years, is that the Washington's just given up on diplomacy in the region. And I include Iran there. I mean, they're kind of out of practice here, because when I listen to what the Iranian officials in this charm offensive, what's being called, and then I look what's going on in Washington, you know, they just say, well, no, this is, they're pathological liars, they've never told the truth, et cetera, et cetera. And then in one country we haven't even mentioned here, Saudi Arabia. I mean, they're certainly not interested in any kind of charm because they're the least charmful people on the planet.
Yeah, I just like to. I sat in both the hearings.
Our rivals.
No, let me go to Tighe here. Let me go to Tighe. Go ahead, Tighe. First, jump in. Go ahead.
I sat in on both the hearings where the United States was trying to push the American public into getting behind them on a rush to war with Syria, where they have no business being. And the chief diplomat of the United States is our Secretary of State, John Kerry. And on his right was the Secretary of Defense, Chuck Hagel, and then General Dempsey, both of which said almost nothing. And our chief diplomat was the one who was trying to push war. Yeah. The idea of the diplomat is supposed to stop war. It's time that our diplomats take the front of all these problems that we have and put the war people back in their barracks, as they say, and let's get some conversations going on. But also, your guest had some amazing things to say. I think one thing that would change the dynamic in this situation is if we saw the suffering of the people in Iran, if we saw the words of the normal person, the worker in Tehran, the farmer out near Mashhad, if we saw the faces of the people and we heard their words, the American public would identify with them immensely, because we have a lot in common with the people of Iran. And it's unfortunate that our government is what's standing in the way. And it's not the Iranian government. And when they use this awful rhetoric, the axis of evil and, you know, they're liars and things like this, it does not help. We need real diplomats doing the real job that the United States wants.
I think that no one should argue with you on that point, because we don't see a lot of diplomacy, but we'll see what happens here. Many thanks today to my guests in Washington and in Irvine. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.
I love it.